Hi, and welcome to the third in our series on Middle Eastern and Islamic history. We are going to finish up our discussion on Arab socialism from last night. This presentation goes with last week's presentation in that we're discussing general political trends in the Middle East rather than, let's say, specific countries or specific in-depth experiences like we've been doing for the last, let's say, 15 episodes or so. All right, the rules for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we will be discussing today. And I'm going to try and give this presentation from a secular perspective, trying not to bias towards any of the sides in this view. But that said, we should be respectful. This topic concerns the current day and age, and of course, it's going to be very sensitive to certain people in certain ways. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time to your questions, comments, and clarifications. What I like to say is that this presentation will be a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll tell you enough to catch you up. And a 201 meaning that if you know the basics of what I'm going to talk about, I'll still probably tell you stuff that you didn't know. I also say that there's going to be a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that if I don't cover all my slides, it doesn't matter. At 2 hours, I will stop, and whatever I don't finish will roll over into next week. So that way, you know and I know that we agreed to only be together for that certain amount of time with new information. That said, if people have questions, comments, I'm more than happy to continue to talk about these issues, talk about these things. Just no new slides will be revealed. When I put dates below a person, if it's a political figure, those are their years of service. If I put below a philosopher or an ideologue, it's their life because they didn't hold any specific office. Now, this, like all of the other entries in this series, will be recorded and will be put up on our YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube page in order to see not only this episode, but all the previous episodes in this series and the other series that we're going to do. We'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. And if you want to see more of our activities or you really like what you've seen tonight and you want to see more of it, please join our meetup and you will be able to see all of the presentations, not only that I give, but that other people in our group History, Mostly Ancient Discussions, do give. And while we offer this freely, Zoom, Meetup, and YouTube Premium all do cost money, so we appreciate any donations that you can give in order to help us keep the lights on. All right, so last week, we talked about the relationship in the medieval period between the medieval leaders, be it the secular sultan and the religious Sheikh al-Islam. And of course, these titles could differ from country to country in the medieval period. And the Sheikh al-Islam in the Ottoman Empire, for example, was a governmental ministry. But in other contexts, it could just be lay power. They could just exist in the general street, but they have an incredible commanding presence. Think, if you want a different context, Jerry Falwell, right, from the American context. Incredibly powerful politically, despite the fact that he had no official office. And within the Islamic system, there was a set of duties that were separated. And so that you ended up with a case where the religious establishment was often the check against the Sultan and much more connected to the common people because of its creation of qadis or judgeships in the local territories and its position of controlling all the imams who were in all the mosques. And so they had a much greater connection to the local people. And in that way, the religious establishment was itself the moral check in many ways on the capricious power of the Sultan. And we're going to see how that applies when we talk about the different political views that we're going to see later today. One of the things that we talked about, right, as a fundamental piece in understanding medieval states as well, and we need to remember this, is that the difference between a medieval state and a modern state at a fundamental level is that a medieval state is one with attenuated power structures. The Sultan has complete power, perhaps you couldn't believe, but once you get to the level below, the governors of the various provinces, and below them, the lords of various estates, and below them, on and on, each of these has a certain degree of local power because it's difficult to move, it's difficult to communicate, it's difficult to do all of these things. And so there's a degree of tribute and trust that exists between the different layers, and that in turn creates power structures at each level of governance. In a modern state, the government in the capital city is the government, and they control all of the lower areas. They control the taxes and the monetary supply, and accordingly, they are able to institute unitary power without the need of corroborating structures, of help in the local provinces. If they don't like a person in power, they can replace them in the local areas. That's not something that was easily doable in the medieval state. And so this degree of centralization fundamentally changes the roles of the different entities. What we end up seeing, right, when we talk about governments that exist in the modern period, is that we see governments that have said, all right, we had a check and a balance with the Sultan and the Sheikh al-Islam. What can we do with this balance between the secular leader and the religious leader? Well, we don't need a balance anymore. We don't need the religious leader to justify the legitimacy of the secular leader, and we don't need the secular leader to protect the physical viability of the religious leader. We can choose one and have a unified system that is more likely to progress us into the modern age, into the Enlightenment age that the Europeans have talked about. And 4 of these answers said, we keep the Sultan, we keep the secular ruler, and we get rid of the religious ruler. That's the liberals, the ethnic nationalists, the border nationalists, and the Arab socialists. And we talked about the first 3 last week. The last one, the Islamists made the opposite argument. They said, let's keep the religious leader. We don't need the secular leader. The religious leader can take care of all secular governance as well. And so we're going to see how that works and how that fit in. But following the track of the Arab socialists, we see that they believe in a transnational Arab identity, right? Arabs are not constrained to any one country. This is the idea of Pan-Arabism. And when we talk about this Pan-Arab identity, you should understand the size of the territory that they're talking about. They're talking about a significant amount of territory being areas where Arabs live. And the fundamental idea of this Pan-Arab idealism is that in truth, all Arabs are citizens of an Arab nation, and that that nation has simply been divided by imperialists, colonizers, what have you. But it's not a natural division that should occur. It's something that has occurred strictly because of historical politics. Now, for those of you who've been following the series for quite a while, you'll notice that in the medieval period, we saw 2 of the following things. The first one is that we had a number of independent states that existed throughout the Middle East. In fact, no state has been able to control the entire Arab world since the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate, and that was in the year 750. So Muslims haven't been united, Arabs haven't been united in one state for most of the history of the Islamic world. The Ottomans came close, but that sort of falls into the second thing that we've seen, which is that the Ottomans were controlling a medieval state. And so the degrees of autonomy that existed, especially in areas far from Constantinople, places like Tunisia or Algeria, places like the southern parts of Iraq and Kuwait, places like the northern part of Yemen that were technically under Ottoman control, had a significant degree of autonomy. I would say so significant, in fact, that they had their own armies, they had their own taxation policy, they had their own foreign relations. We talked about in the context of medieval Algeria that when France and Spain sent representatives to Constantinople to ask them to tell the Algerians to stop raiding their vessels, the Sultan in Constantinople said, you should send your emissaries to Algiers and negotiate with the Algerians themselves. He was talking about a part of what was nominally his empire, but it was functionally independent. So this idea of Arab unity doesn't fit in with the historical narrative, but it felt natural with the rise of a romantic nationalism that was gripping the Arab world and a resistance to colonization. And the Arabs had this shared experience of imperialism and colonialism, and therefore they did actually speak the same language. They were actually the same people, and increasingly they heard the same voices. One important point to talk about when we're talking about Arab socialism is that Arab socialism, while it considered Islam to have been proof of how incredibly superior the Arab mind was, in particular, Zaki al-Arsuzi makes this argument. None of the Pan-Arab socialists argued that Islam should be enshrined in any gubernatorial capacity, or that being a Muslim was a criteria for citizenship in an Arab state. In fact, if you look at the four men up here, the four men we talked about last time, only Sat al-Khusri is a Muslim. Georgi Zaidan and Michel Aflaq are both Christian. They're Eastern Orthodox. And Zaki al-Arsuzi is Alawite. So these individuals considered themselves all part of the Arab world. And it really comes to a question of what is an Arab in order to be in their box of acceptable under Arab socialism or out of their box, a minority that's not able to assimilate. And Sat al-Husri takes the view that any person who speaks Arabic as a mother tongue is an Arab. This is not the view of many people who do speak Arabic as a mother tongue. There were a number of Maronite Lebanese, Coptic Egyptians, Assyrians in northern Iraq, Syria, southern Turkey, and Iran. Jews as well throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and other religious minorities that we've talked about, like the Mandeans or the Shabaki. These groups spoke Arabic as their native language, but they didn't consider themselves Arab in certain contexts and in certain cases. Sat al-Husri's view, and the view shared by many Arab socialists, is that those who reject an Arab identity but do speak Arabic as a mother tongue are in truth Arabs, and they should be educated to the point that they accept their true national consciousness, and that all other national consciousnesses that would be in place of that Arab identity should be rejected and should be just removed from the ideological context. That said, those individuals who did not speak Arabic as a native language, such as the Turks, the Kurds, the Persians, the Amazigh of North Africa, these individuals were not Arabs because they did not speak Arabic, and therefore were naturally beyond the confines of the state that they were defining. Blacks as well, if they didn't speak Arabic. One of the difficulties that a lot of people have when it comes to Arab socialism, therefore, is defining it on this left-wing to right-wing perspective. One of the things that we covered last time is that there is a socialist aspect to Arab socialism. It required the breakup of large landholding estates and the giving of land to the lower and middle classes. It required the expropriation or nationalization of foreign assets and the reacquisition of those by local governments, and a number of other economic actions that would be considered left-wing. But its views towards nationalism and the nation and its construction fit much more into what we typically consider to be right-wing ideology. So if you look at this diagram of left-wing and right-wing ideology, the first 2 points fall under the left-wing prognosis, that they're supportive of republics and secular systems that require revolution, that wealth should be redistributed, and industries should be nationalized. But the bottom 3 fit much more on the right-wing side, that the government should crush protests to ensure peace and stability that benefit everyone, that the national group should be prioritized over other groups in terms of ideology, economics, and image, and that foreign policy should be expansionist. The military is a key institution of the government. In fact, many of the Arab socialist governments were organized around a military strongman, as opposed to more democratic institutions or more egalitarian institutions. So while many people will consider Arab socialists left because relative to ethnic nationalists, they're more left than them, in an American context or in a European context, I believe that these parties would be characterized as right-wing. But whether it's left-wing or right-wing, their ideas don't neatly fall into these traditional European categories. And we started talking about Nasser. Nasser came to power in 1952 in what was called the Free Officers' Coup. He grabbed a number of military generals. He was himself a colonel at the time, and he overtook the government. Now, at that time, you can see Mohammed Naguib on his left-hand side, Mohammed Naguib was a senior general in the Egyptian armed forces and was significantly more popular at the time than Nasser was. But Nasser, by 1954, had him sidelined and was able to become the dominant voice in Egyptian politics. And after 54, he began to become incredibly popular. And we talked about a few of those things here, but I just sort of want to stress a few of them again. The first one is that he understood that in the 1950s and 1960s, most Arabs did not have televisions, but they did have radios. And so he cultivated his own cult of personality using a radio station named Sawt al-Arab, or the Voice of the Arabs. And in this radio station, he put out communications on the daily talking about the Arab nation, its history, its growth, and of course, its enemies. Sawt al-Arab almost daily talked about a possible Egyptian invasion of Israel. It talked about a number of other themes about throwing out colonizers. Remember, at this point, Morocco and Tunisia were still French protectorates. They wouldn't become independent until 1956 and 1957. Algeria was still under French occupation. Algeria would not see freedom until 1962. And many countries in the Middle East had Western-aligned governments. For example, Jordan's King Hussein was Western-supported, and in fact, the lead general in his army was a British lieutenant general who was on loan. That's Pasha, Glub Pasha. In Iraq, the prime minister was a British-aligned monarchist named Nouri as-Said, and he was also an individual that had strong proclivities towards the West. So in many cases, what Nasser was saying in terms of Arabs retaking their own power was incredibly attractive. And the fact is that the Arabic language, despite having numerous dialects, can be made mutually intelligible if you find a place along the continuum between traditional Arabic and local dialect that allows people to not find the words absurdly historical and archaic, but at the same time allows it to go beyond small towns and areas where specific words were used. And Nasser perfected this. Nasser found the balance between Cairene dialect and traditional Arabic in order to disperse his messages and really bring about a unity within the Arab world in terms of consciousness. He was also incredibly popular because he started to do things that impacted Egyptians' lives. He started to create a number of conditions for labor improvement, small things, but those things added up. Another important thing is that he restored a sense of pride in many respects to Egypt. The nationalization of the Suez Canal wasn't, strictly speaking, to prevent the British from using the revenue generation of the canal, although that was certainly part of it. But it was the idea that Egypt would control Egyptian things. Egypt would be in power over Egyptian things. And so in 1956, when he nationalized the canal, it was an effective show that Egypt was going to be the steward of its own destiny. In a similar way, Nasser would eventually seek funding for the Aswan High Dam. And the Aswan High Dam, in addition to taking care of a significant amount of Egypt's power needs and requirements, was able to stop the annual flood of the Nile, which meant that farmers had a dependable river, Nile, as opposed to one that would routinely overrun their houses, especially as most of Egypt's population is along the river path and the river delta. That's not to say that he went unopposed in this. You had the Cold War onsetting in the beginning of Nasser's term in office. And so Nasser was originally aligned with the West. Egypt had historically had decent relations with Western countries, but Nasser was open to any possibility. The West, however, wanted to support a number of specific states in the attempt to prevent Soviet expansion and the expansion of socialism. A lot of the nationalization that Nasser was doing or considering doing looked very suspiciously like that form of nationalism. And so when we have the division in the Cold War, we end up seeing a division that begins to push Egypt more and more towards the Soviet sphere. But let's talk about the West for a second. The first country that we should sort of narrow on is Turkey. Now, Turkey had a border facing the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was beginning to press territorial claims on Turkey, wanting to take back territory that it had controlled in 1878. And Turkey was genuinely afraid of a Soviet invasion. The Soviet military was significantly more advanced than the Turkish military had been. Turkey had stayed out of World War II, but it was in no fit state to take on a world superpower. And so Turkey and its government under İsmet İnönü looked towards the West, and Turkey became a member of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, which was founded in 1949 in order to secure the anti-Soviet Western Europe under the American auspices. And so once Turkey became part of NATO, the Soviet claims against Turkey were retrenched because the Soviet Union did not want to get into a direct war with the United States. At the same time, the nascent state of Israel, after fighting a war of independence, which preceded Nasser's rise to power, that state had to create alliances in order to secure its place in the Middle East. It made alliances, of course, with Britain and France, which is why Israel began to fly French aircraft like the Mirage 3C. But they could not make allies with any of the Arab countries in the region because those countries had all been deeply opposed to Israel's existence. They needed to make allies with countries that were further away. And so Turkey, already in the camp of the West because of NATO, made a suitable ally for Israel. And Iran, a country that was also afraid of Soviet influence, became another ally of Israel, which sounds odd to say today because Iran and Israel are not allies at this point in time. But at that point in time, they were. In fact, up until 1979, Israel's largest single supplier of petroleum was Iran. But Iran's fear of the Soviet Union also led to an organization by the leaders of the various states that bordered the Soviet Union of what was called the Baghdad Pact, where the British led a military alliance to hold back the Soviet Union. Now, the pact really collapsed in the following decades, but this should show the intent by the British to restrain Soviet influence in the Middle East and the desire by many Middle Eastern leaders to secure their position through an alliance to the British. One country that was not a member of the Baghdad Pact because it was worried about its own insurrection was Jordan, but Jordan already had strong relations with the British through Lieutenant General John Bagot Glubb, that Glubb Pasha I talked about before, who served as the chief commander of the Jordanian armed forces, the Arab Legion, until he was removed in 1956. We're going to talk about why that was in a bit. But there were other left-wing thrusts in the Middle East aside from Nasser. In particular, in 1951, the Shah of Iran, the king of Iran, abdicated, and his prime minister, Mossadegh, began to rule in his own right. And Mossadegh had the view that Iranian oil should be nationalized. We'll talk about this a lot more in detail when we talk about Iran in particular. But because nationalization would result in a significant loss of revenues to the British requested the Americans in 1953 to perform a CIA operation codenamed Operation Ajax to launch a military coup in Iran and reinstall the Shah. This was successful, and Mossadegh was removed. In the contemplation of the act, the United States' primary motivation was to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union, and a socialist leader in Iran would be seen to be contributing to what was known then as the domino effect. The idea that if one country becomes socialist or communist, other countries will soon follow in its wake. And so the United States wanted to avoid that possibility. After Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal, he began to speak more forcefully about his desire to prevent the Israelis from using it, and his desire to assert Egyptian independence. And so Britain, France, and Israel began to coordinate with each other as to how they were going to prevent Nasser's nationalization, which took place in June of 1956. So Israel was going to launch a military invasion on the ground, and the British and French were going to protect that from the sea and from the air. Now, diplomatic pressure from the United States effectively meant that the British and the French called off the attack. The Israelis, not so much. And so Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula and took all the territory up to the canal, allowing them to denationalize it. But what was interesting was that the United States asserted its power diplomatically. Eisenhower, the president of the United States, pressed Israel to withdraw from the territory it had militarily taken and to withdraw to the Israeli borders. If Israel did not do this, he was promising to cut off Israeli financial support from the United States. Now, the United States and Israel were not as close at that point as they are now. And the United States was not Israel's primary ally at this point. France was. That said, Israel being cut off from the United States was more than Israeli politicians were willing to bear at that point. Israel has always wanted to remain on the good side of the United States. And so they withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula. And UNEF, United Nations Emergency Force, peacekeepers were deployed in the Sinai Peninsula to see the Israelis leaving. The members of the coalition who formed those peacekeepers came from nations that recognized both Israel and many of the Arab states. They were seen to be neutral parties and acceptable to both Egypt and Israel. Nasser saw the forced Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai under the American auspices as being a victory for Egypt. And he touted it as much. And many of the Egyptians saw it as well, that Nasser had been able to nationalize the canal, and the world protected his right to nationalize the canal. Now, the question arises, of course, why did Eisenhower break ranks with the British and the French? The American view in this period was anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist, and they saw the British and French attempts to retain the Suez Canal as a continuation of the imperialist legacy of both of those countries. Accordingly, it sought to restrain that and allow the Egyptians to attain their own territory. Now, another point that's important to make here is that this event was a determining factor in the end of the British and the French as large-scale international power brokers. The Americans made it clear through their action here that they could compel British and French behavior on the international stage. And from this point forward, the United States becomes the dominant actor in the Western world and the counterweight to the Soviet Union, more so than it had been previously. One of the things that Eisenhower did while he was president as well, in addition to what he did in the Sinai Peninsula, is that he issued what was called the Eisenhower Doctrine. And this doctrine was a view that if any state in the Middle East was afraid of falling to communists or socialists, that they could reach out to the United States, and the United States would defend the regime from that possibility. This was in line again with that domino theory that communism would overtake if one country fell. So we have the 1958 crisis in Lebanon, which sort of brings this Eisenhower doctrine to a head. You have Camille Chamoun, and Camille Chamoun is the president of Lebanon. That's a position that has historically been reserved to the Catholic Maronite ethnicity. Remember, Lebanon is confessionalist, as we discussed in episode 54. Now, he wanted to run for a second term, which was deeply unpopular. And in fact, within Lebanon, there was a strong support for Nasser. There was a push for Nasserists to take power. Now, that particular picture is of the modern Nasserist party in Lebanon, but there were a significant amount of Nasrists at the time. Shamoun was not facing a direct threat from communists, right? He was facing a direct threat from Nasrists. And as we pointed out, Arab socialism has some socialist aspects and it has some right-wing aspects. So it's not fair to say that he was under serious threat as the Eisenhower Doctrine would have understood it. That said, Shamoun called upon the United States to defend him in power through the Eisenhower Doctrine. And Eisenhower considered the situation, and in his view, it was more important that the United States be perceived as a defender of states in the Middle East than it be that he adheres strictly to the terms of the Eisenhower Doctrine that he had issued. And so in Operation Blue Bat and several other smaller operations, the United States began to land forces in Lebanon. The generals on the time were able to prevent a large-scale Lebanese civil war, although there was certainly fighting for a month. The generals were able to negotiate that Shamoun would step down, and one of the generals in the Lebanese military, another Maronite Catholic, Fouad Shahab, related to Bashir Shihab II, that we've talked about previously, I think also in episode 55 and episode 39, that he would take power as the next president of Lebanon. In this way, Nasrists were thwarted in order to preserve an older border nationalist status quo. But Nasser was undaunted. Lebanon was not the only country that had an ascendant Nasserist political view. In fact, in Syria, Nasserism was incredibly popular, and this led to a declaration by Shukri al-Quwatli, who was the president of Syria, that he would join with Egypt to create the United Arab Republic. This was, in actuality, one country. And suffice it to say, and of course we'll discuss this a lot more when we talk about Syrian politics in the future, those countries were fundamentally different in terms of their own internal organization, but they had been so swept up in this nationalism and this fervor towards being part of the Arab nation that they didn't notice these differences. But I'm going to outline them, a few of them here. The first one is that Egypt was very culturally unified. You had large businesses that had existed, but most of those had become nationalized by this point. And you had a large agrarian poor that mostly owned their own land or parts of it. Syria, by contrast, if we remember back from our earlier episodes, had large-scale landowners, and the majority of the population would sharecrop on those lands. Accordingly, Syria had almost always pursued a more right-wing economic policy, one that facilitated more and more power by those landowners. Syria had also tried, especially during the reign of Adib Shishakli, to reach out to the West and maintain good relations with the West. That, of course, was difficult given the fact that Syria would under no circumstances have any relationship with Israel, which was often a sticking point with Western negotiators. But generally speaking, Syria was not interested in joining the Soviet sphere, was not interested in redistributing land or power. And the conflicts in Syrian internal politics had much more to do with ownership rights and economic power. Another fundamental distinction between Egypt and Syria is that under Nasser, the Coptic national identity became politicized because Copts spoke Arabic as their native language, but many of them did not consider themselves Arabs. And so there was dissent between the Muslim Egyptian population, which by and large considered itself Arab, and the Coptic population that didn't. Many Copts went into exile or were tortured by the regime because of their refusal to accept an Arab identity. In Syria, you had a coalition of a number of different ethno-religions. You had the Druze, the Alawites, the Sunni Muslims, the Assyrians, several Shiite groups like the Ismailis. And these groups had more or less worked together. We saw that during the Syrian Civil War in 1925, which was the Great Syrian Revolt. We saw that in the 1930s negotiations for a constitution. Syria represented its constituencies relatively evenly. And so this also came to a head under the prioritization of Sunni Muslims against other religious groups that Nasser imported. And Nasser, during his control of Syria, began to purge all political influences other than his own, and began to only support Syrians who would be loyal to him, like his vice president, Abdel Hamid al-Sarraj, who you can see in that picture. Abdel Sarraj was an Alawite from Latakia, but he was willing to accept this new style government by Nasser. After a year or so of control over Syria, in which Syria became effectively subservient to Egypt, there began to be a resurgent sense of Syrian nationalism, especially among the Syrian military. And in September of 1961, Haidar al-Khuzbari and a number of other Syrian military leaders attacked the central radio station in Damascus. Remember how important the radio was. They argued, now that they had taken the radio, that they'd taken back Syria, and that the Egyptian soldiers would be sent back to Egypt, and that Syria would become independent again. Now, Nasser refused to withdraw the name United Arab Republic until 1971, 10 years later. But for all intents and purposes, once control of the radio was taken, remember, radio is the fundamental voice of the Arab people at this point, Syria was independent again. One of the funny ironies of history is that there were a number of Syrians who were willing to work on the Arab Socialist solution while Nasser was there. That was the Ba'ath Party. And we've seen the Ba'ath Party in its Iraqi incarnation more recently with Saddam Hussein. But despite the fact that this was an Arab Socialist aligned group, Nasser was afraid of them because he was afraid that they would undermine his power. And so he even tried to remove his own allies. And the support of the Ba'ath was critical in allowing those military generals to reassert Syrian independence. Now, nobody could have told that in 1958 that the United Arab Republic would survive for only 3 years. Other countries in the region, especially those that were more American aligned and Western aligned, were worried about their possibility. One of those leaders was King Hussein of Jordan. And he tried to do everything in his power to appear not to be a British stooge, which was one of the perceptions by the people. The first one was that in 1956, he appointed a new prime minister, Suleiman Nablisi, and tried to institute some reforms. But many of those reforms that got across Nablisi's desk enraged King Hussein. And accordingly, after roughly a year in office, Nablisi was removed. And more British-aligned policies were reintroduced. He also expelled the British troops from Jordan. That was Glub Pasha and all of his Arab Legion. That British leadership was removed in order to make it less connected to the British, and that Jordan would have control over its own military. And that didn't quite do it. And so he finally decided in early 1958, about a month after the proclamation of the United Arab Republic, to declare a union with his cousin, Faisal II of Iraq, who was also a Hashemite monarch, and create the Hashemite Union. One would have expected that the British would have supported such a union, given that Jordan had been in the British sphere for a significant period of time, and Faisal II's government, led by Nouria Saeed as prime minister, was also very strongly British aligned. But the British refused to support it, because in this union, they also sought the unification of the Hashemite Union with Kuwait, which was ruled at that time by Abdullah III, As-Salam al-Sabah. And the British did not want to lose Kuwait as a protectorate. So the British sought to undermine the Hashemite Union explicitly because that would lead to the end of Kuwaiti independence, or rather Kuwaiti British dependence. It didn't matter much anyway. On the 14th of July, 1958, the Union was overthrown, primarily because the government in Iraq ceased to be a monarchy. There was a revolution there. Now I have a question of, how about Indonesia? These are Muslims but not Arabs. How do they fit in? Arab nationalists and Pan-Arab nationalism did not appeal to Indonesians. They didn't seek the interest of Indonesians. It's sort of a non-topic. Indonesians have their own forms of nationalism and their own forms of regionalism and sectarianism that are entirely distinct from what we see in the Arab world, even though they could fit in the general buckets. So Egypt began to foster this sense of revolution, this idea of new republics that would be Arab socialist in character, replacing monarchies. And nowhere can we see this better than the North Yemeni Civil War. Now, again, when we talk about Yemen, we're going to get into the complexities of this war. And this war is probably the most difficult to follow of any Middle Eastern conflict in the 20th century. The sides are constantly changing. The factions are constantly evolving and re-evolving. But suffice it to say that Nasser decided to support As-Salal, who was a president in North Yemen, because Yemen had not yet been united. And the Saudis were supporting the royalist faction, the faction behind the king, the Sultan of North Yemen, Muhammad al-Badr. In the course of the war, Nasser committed more and more Egyptian troops to defending the Republican side, defending As-Salal. In fact, half of Egypt's soldiers, 70,000 people, including its best soldiers, were in Yemen throughout the duration of the war. And that timing is particularly important because if you'll notice, the Six-Day War of 1967 against Israel fits exactly within this time period. And Egypt was not able to acquit itself well in that war, in addition to other reasons that we'll discuss, because of its engagement in Yemen. Some historians have even said that the United States' entry into Vietnam, which would occur in the latter part of the 60s and early part of the 70s, could have actually been called America's Yemen, after the degree of difficulty that Nasser had in Yemen, and also the slow drip of the war, that he kept having to allocate more troops. He had to send more advisors. He had to send more forces again and again in repetitive steps in order to try to win the war. And the Republican side did win the war, but only by a hair's margin. They had to incorporate many royalists into the new North Yemen government, although Muhammad al-Badr and the royal family themselves were excluded. Now, I just mentioned that Six-Day War, and it can't be overstated how much this war affected the story of Arab nationalism. So Israel in 6 days was able to take territory from Egypt, Jordan, and from Syria. And Israel was incredibly effective in doing so. They were able to convince the US government at this point that they were there to stay. And this war really becomes the shift between the United States being the primary backer of Israel, whereas previously it had been France. Numerous divisions of Egyptians were captured by the Israelis. And Nasser had been leading up to this war for quite some time. He'd been constantly on the radio talking about how he would defeat Israel. He had the UN peacekeepers removed from the Sinai Peninsula and had Egyptian troops stationed along the border as late as May of 1967. And the loss was abysmal. After the war, the Arab position entrenched with the Khartoum Resolution of 1967 that held the three no's, right? That there would be no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. That was what the Arab Socialists promised. But we have to understand just how severe this was. Many Egyptians argue that they were not allowed to fight as they would have wanted to in the Six-Day War. What does that mean? When Israel made its first advances across the Sinai Peninsula, the Egyptians called a hasty retreat. Well, first, Israel had bombed 2/3 of the Egyptian Air Force on the tarmac before it could get up, and so the tanks were completely uncovered. But the Egyptian army command to retreat was not an organized retreat, it was a hasty one. The Egyptians knew the Sinai less well than the Israelis. The Israelis had planned out where they were going to go and which areas were viable and not. The Egyptians hadn't. And so Egypt literally drove its tanks right into the arms of Israeli bombers. You can see this is a picture of a napalmed Egyptian tank. Dozens of Egyptian tanks were taken offline in a matter of hours. Some of them drove into the middle of sandy areas that are just too fine for them to escape. And so from a military perspective, it was an absolute defeat. But it wasn't only that. Nasser had reached out to Jordan and told the Jordanians that they were winning when they were losing. And so the Jordanians committed to fight against the Israelis, and the Jordanians lost, resulting in the expulsion of 300,000 Palestinians, be it by their own choice or be it by the incoming waves of Israeli military. Those Palestinians were now on Nasser's head. The next piece to take out of this is that Israel had proved that Arab nationalism and Arab unity couldn't solely destroy Israel. Israel would be capable of defending itself on its own territory. It really undercut the argument of a unified Arab people, of a unified Arab identity, and of a unified Arab goal. One of the ironies is that the Six-Day War also gave Jordan an opportunity to legitimize itself. Remember that Jordan was facing a legitimacy problem in that many Arab socialists within the country wanted to topple the government and create an Arab socialist government, as had happened in Egypt. After the Six-Day War, the Israelis received intelligence that Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, an organization founded in 1964 to support Palestinian nationalism and gain that through acts of terrorism and militarism, would be in the area around Karame, right across the border from the Israeli-controlled West Bank. So Israel launched 2 operations at the same time over into the West Bank in order to take the town of Karame and capture Yasser Arafat. The battle went extremely poorly for the Israelis. The Jordanians were able to score massive successes. In fact, over 13 tanks, Israeli tanks, were recovered. Jordanian fighters acquitted themselves very well. And King Hussein actually declared, "We have all become fedayeen," referring to these kinds of militant leaders that would exist among the Palestinians. His ability to cause the Israelis significant harm, despite the fact that the Israelis achieved their mission objectives, bolstered his own image as a defender of Jordan and a defender of the Arab world, and cast questions of legitimacy on the Arab Socialist movement, because Jordan alone was able to cause significant losses on the Israeli side, whereas the Egyptians ran away in panic. It's been said of the Six-Day War that Israelis planned to win the war and Egyptians planned to have a parade. And that was clearly not the way that Jordan acted in Karame. And so that began to legitimize Jordan to a certain degree. Because of the failure in the Six-Day War and a number of other factors going on, but that's the predominant one, you have what has been jokingly dubbed the coup d'etat season. Now you can see all of the different coups. Each of the countries in red had at least one coup. The year of the coup is listed along with whether it failed, F, or was successful, S. In particular, I want to draw attention to the coup in Jordan. That was what is called Black September, where Palestinians, encouraged by their successes alongside Jordanian forces in the Battle of Karama, decide to try and overtake the Jordanian state. And the Jordanian government launches a civil war of its own to put down the Palestinian nationalists in Jordan. It's debated how many people died in Black September. The Jordanian governmental estimate is 300 people, which is certainly nowhere near reality. The Palestinian estimate is closer to 20,000. Somewhere between there is the truth. Another one that I want to draw attention to is in 1969, a number of rebels tried to overthrow the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and create the Republic of the Arabian Peninsula. This further drew the Saudis into the American sphere, wanting to have increased protection against these Nasserist kinds of forces. Some of these coups actually reinstated traditional power brokers. If you look in 1970, there was a coup in Oman where the British helped Sultan Qaboos overthrow his father. And Qaboos remained Sultan of Oman for 50 years, in which he had strong relations with Western powers as a direct result of being supported by the British, who were the traditional leaders in the region. And of course, the 1969 revolt in Libya secured the reign of Gaddafi, who ruled in that country for over 40 years as well. All right. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat, and I will explain a little bit about who we are. This is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I'm Richard. I host the Middle Eastern Islamic History group on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. There's also the Asian Philosophy group that meets on Saturdays. Aaron and I periodically do a European Union security presentation. There is a episode of The Dead Languages this Saturday by John Maloney on the ancient Hebrew language as opposed to modern Hebrew. Jane recently did a series on Agrippina the Younger for Powerful Women, and we'll have another episode in a month. And we also have our short run series like the Russo-Ukrainian War series that we'll pick up in a few months. And we just did our tour of India for the Islamic city tours with Nurul. And of course, we have our older series that you can see on our YouTube page for medieval and modern Europe, ancient Greece, history of sports, history of technologies, Jewish history, all these different kinds of things. So, questions, comments, clarifications? Considering no other questions, I'm going to close this out and we will pick up the discussion of Israeli history, which will take us through the next 2 weeks, where we go through what has happened since the Independence War in 1948 all the way until the present time. All right. See everybody next week.